Tonight's the second in a four-part series on LaRouche's economics, which will skip the 2 weeks for the holidays and resume January 6th, 2024. The first class a week ago took off from Lyndon LaRouche's bitter, vehement struggle against or the fiction or the idol of artificial intelligence. It's bitter struggle against artificial intelligence from 1948 through 1952. And in the course of that struggle, he developed or completed or filled out, really revolutionized his view of economics to something which had approximations in history, for instance, in Alexander Hamilton, but a deeper view of economics which had never before existed. It was forced to develop it in order to overcome the dogma of artificial intelligence. So tonight we'll continue, beginning with Bruce, who's on the line with me, and the title for tonight's episode is The End of 500 Years of Stupidity. So, Bruce, take it away.
Yeah, that's an appropriate title. I might just say parenthetically, it contrasts with a statement that was made by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the Doha Forum last week, where he claimed that we're seeing the end of the 500 years of the I can't actually remember the words he said, the British Empire or the American Empire or globalism or so forth. And then he proceeded to outline, Western dominance, the dominance of Western civilization, which unfortunately showed a certain level of misunderstanding on the part of Foreign Minister Lavrov, who is a very smart man. But it's unfortunately kind of a widespread view, especially right now, among those people who look to what they call the BRICS or the Global South as somehow coming up as the new wave of civilization while Western civilization collapses. And I think it has to be corrected, because Western civilization is not collapsing. What's collapsing, what's ending, is 500 years of the British Empire, or what must end is 500 years of the British Empire. And Western civilization actually must endure. And LaRouche was very insistent on that. And he saw that there was a cultural conflict that has gone on actually for at least 500 years between two different concepts of man, and that really form the basis of economics, his idea of economics. And that is expressed also in this fight around artificial intelligence. If you believe that a machine can think or have intelligence, or can be built to have intelligence, or programmed to have intelligence, that's a very evil concept of intelligence and of man. It may be a modern version of a very old imperial idea, which basically said man doesn't have any intelligence at all. He's fundamentally an animal, and therefore that justifies an imperial system in which a small group of oligarchs rule over the rest of mankind like cattle, who can't think and can be controlled by what today we call artificial intelligence or behavior modification or various other names. Now, this was basically the general condition of mankind, with few exceptions, going all the way back to the Babylonian Empire. And every single one of those empires did collapse. But the modern version of it, the British Empire, is of course collapsing right now. But LaRouche saw this in 1948 in two ways. One is a cultural shift which was going on in among his peers, the returning veterans of World War II, who had survived the Depression and saw the United States pull itself under Roosevelt's leadership out of the Depression to become an industrial superpower that was able to provide the logistical and scientific capability to not just overcome the economic crisis of the 1920s and 30s, late 20s and 30s, but to create the basis by which the newly decolonized areas of the world, which were the United States would liberate from the British, French, Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish empires, and apply those same capabilities to transforming those countries. And LaRouche recognized that what happened to his generation was that there was a change in the way people thought. There was a change in the mind. During the period of the Depression, people were very down in the dumps, as you might say, and they had very little confidence in their own intellectual and creative capabilities. But under the experience of the recovery from the Depression and the war mobilization, the creative powers of the mind were activated. And then at the end of World War II, as the returning soldiers came back and confronted the dismantling of that system and confronted what today we might consider to be a mild version of the deep state, the kind of police state apparatus which was coming in through McCarthyism and Trumanism and so forth, those creative powers began to close up, and the country began to sort of adopt a kind of pessimism, consumerism, and cowardice. And he recognized that this was consistent, coherent, or concomitant with the collapse of the shift in economics away from the kind of science-oriented industrial base, although today it would look quite, compared to what we have today, it would look quite good. But he saw this subtle shift going on in which the economy was shifting from a credit productive oriented economy to a debt oriented consumer based economy. We can go into more details in the Q&A if you want. He wrote extensively about this at the time, and as a result, he was able to forecast the 1957 economic crisis and warned of future crises. But he also experienced this, as we discussed last week, this shift to what today we call AI, of Norbert Wiener and Shannon and so forth. And that he recognized was really the key to this change, was not really in a question of policy relating to what people would think of as economics, that is finance, production, manufacturing, this kind of thing, but was a change in the conception of man that was generally accepted. And the idea of man as a machine, the idea that the mind, the human mind, can only rearrange existing ideas or existing text, as is done in the so-called large language models today, is just a false idea of man, and is monstrously evil to try and use such systems to control the mind. That the key to an economy is the increasing power of creative powers of the human mind. And he, from that, developed his concept of economics, focusing on what does it mean to recognize, to understand the creative powers of the human mind. And
what would you think about introducing maybe at this point or reintroducing some ideas about thermodynamics because it's closely related, and I think will be to the rest of our discussion. We also came up last week, if you think it's germane.
No, I think that's exactly where I was going, which is that the issue there in terms of the creative powers of the human mind was reflected in the concept of the second law of thermodynamics and questions of thermodynamics. Now, let me try and just explain this, sort of on a surface level, and then in the Q&A we can get into more details. But what LaRouche pointed out in terms of the economy is that if you look at the progress of mankind and the adoption of the creation of new scientific discoveries and also new cultural discoveries, ideas of man, these creations of the mind, of the imagination, lead to the development of new technologies, which in turn, when applied, completely change man's relationship to nature and also reorganizes nature and itself. This violates what, since the middle of the 19th century, was known as the second law of thermodynamics, which basically says that the universe is statistically organized. It is fundamentally, it is nothing but a random process. And all physical processes are basically random interactions. And that according to the principle of thermodynamics, the tendency of the universe is always to increase its randomness. That is to go from states of higher organization to lower organization. A simple example of this is, putting cream in your coffee and it distributes out to equilibrium, or putting an ice cube into coffee and the coffee gets cooler and the ice cube gets warmer till it reaches some temperature in the middle, and it can no longer change anymore. So that the physical policy, the physical characteristic of the universe tends from states of high potential for change to no change at all. And that, as the quotes we read from Norbert Wiener last week showed, Wiener said that anything that mankind does that goes in contradiction to that is simply an illusion, because the universe is fundamentally random. And therefore, there's random interactions will always tend towards equilibrium. Now, in the economy, that doesn't happen. In human existence, you can see this in terms of human progress, and we can measure that by various parameters, such as potential relative increase in potential relative population density, increase in energy flux density, and most importantly, in general terms, increase in man's power in and over nature. So the question for LaRouche was, how does that occur? Where is the source of the increased power of mankind to improve his condition from generation to generation? And that's the subject of economics.
The whole apparent paradox that LaRouche confronted there, and as you pointed out to me and others of us, I mean, the whole paradox he confronted then, I mean, he perhaps confronted earlier, but the paradox he had to wrestle with and overcome from 1948 to 52 has risen to the surface among contemporary scientists right here as we're speaking. I mean, it's something which you pointed out to me, and it's really quite extraordinary. There is, I mean, as I said in another connection, but if you look at science, there seems to be the seeds of a new renaissance in science, fighting back against what you called 500 years of stupidity, namely Cartesianism, Cartesian mechanism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when LaRouche addressed this, he understood it in exactly those terms. And what happened basically 500 years ago with Descartes is he introduced, along with Newton, who was himself Cartesian, who considered himself a follower of Descartes, both of whom really were followers of Aristotle, that there's basically the material world, which obeys material laws of physics. And this includes also living things, which are simply machines, material machines. Today, you see people express this in terms of the genetic theory of biology, that all living systems are simply like computers. You have DNA, and RNA, and the RNA copies the DNA code, and the DNA and then makes proteins, and those proteins then carry out the metabolic processes of the cells, and so forth. You see it also, and people accept it when they talk about, the mind, and they think, that somehow the mind is processing information, and that's the switching on and off of neurons in the brain, which is the source of all thought. Since it's Beethoven's birthday, I think that's readily disproven by just listening to any of Beethoven's compositions, and to realize these are not the result of random firing of neurons in the brain, like some, switches inside a computer. And therefore, what we call, according to Descartes and also Newton, what we call the soul or the mind or consciousness or any of these characteristics that we experience and that we know, these are separate from the material world. And there's no effect between these things, these immaterial processes, and the material world. In Newton's days, for example, he had this fight with, or Kepler had this fight with the pre-Newtonians, the Ptolemaic people, who under Aristotle believed that, for example, no material body could be moved except by another material body. So therefore, the planets were moved by transparent crystalline spheres, physical spheres that existed in space, and they moved the planets by physical action on the planets. And Kepler said, no, that's not the case. The planets are moved by a species, which he says was the Latin word for idea. And this was the principle of gravitation, that an immaterial process, an idea, moved the planets. So this was introduced and became prominent in science, this Cartesian view, although every progress in science over the last 15 years occurred by people who rejected it. And then starting throughout most of the 20th century in particular, but especially in the period post-World War II, this became the sort of mechanistic idea of biology, of life, that life is just a result, the development of life, and life itself is just a machine-like process. There is no purpose to life, and there is no intention to life. And this has proven a complete disaster. Now, LaRouche fought that, and over the course of his career, he spent a lot of time trying to activate other scientists and other thinkers and artists, and through his writings, to polemicize very vehemently against this Cartesian view. But he was pretty much alone. There were very few people who would speak this. Otherwise, they would be considered mystics or religious or so forth. But recently, I've begun to sort of look into some of other scientists who are trying to answer various questions that require a radical revision, similar to what LaRouche did, on the question of life. For example, astrobiologists who are trying to look at, could life exist outside of Earth? And how would you know that? And that raises the question, well, how does life come about on Earth? And so there are several of these scientists that are quite interesting. One I would name would be a woman named Sarah Walker at Arizona State University, and her collaborator, Lee Cronin, who's a chemist out of University of Glasgow, who recently has published a paper on what he calls assembly theory, in which they argue that life is a unique capability in the universe, and that life cannot be accounted for by the laws of physics, that it's a separate principle, and that they don't understand it. They say we don't understand what life is, but we're being held back by trying to understand what life is from the standpoint of the laws of physics. There's a lot of other paradoxes which come up in this, but this is exactly what LaRouche has pointed out. And in fact, he said also was inspired by the work of Vladimir Vernadsky, the great Russian biogeophysicist who lived in the end of the 19th century, halfway through the 20th century. He was a collaborator of Louis Pasteur and the Curies. He has a very interesting history himself. We could talk about that in the question period. But Vernadsky indicated that there were three different phase spaces, so to speak, in the universe. One was, and on the Earth, one was the domain, the abiotic domain, that is the domain of non-living processes, the domain of life, and the domain of what he called the noosphere, what LaRouche called cognition. And that these three phase spaces are interacting on the Earth everywhere. And LaRouche spoke about this from the standpoint that this really is the essence of economics, is the interaction of these three phase spaces under the control of mankind by its influence in the cognitive domain, the noosphere. And I think, as you can recognize already, this is a complete opposite of what we're being fed with this myth of artificial intelligence and machine learning and the application of these methods to controlling the economy and human behavior.
And then, I mean, do you want to carry the thermodynamic discussion toward economics from there? Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, okay, so we have, as I mentioned, you have on the one hand the idea of the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is always tending towards equilibrium. And then you have the actual universe as expressed in the economy, as LaRouche defined it, which is actually tending in the opposite direction. If instead of thinking of this as being going from order to disorder, or higher organization to lower organization, think about it from the standpoint of change. If something is in a state of equilibrium, it can't change anymore. If a system, once a system gets to the state of equilibrium, it's what thermodynamicists would say is at the state of maximum entropy, and it can't change. It can fluctuate, microscopic fluctuations, but it.
Wiener said, as I quoted last week, Wiener said, the stable state of a living thing is death.
Exactly, right? So, for example, you know, a living organism, when it's alive, is incorporating atoms and molecules from the surrounding environment, transforming those, excreting molecules and substances to the environment, and therefore changing the environment in which it's living in, and also changing itself, reproducing, developing, and so on and so forth. It's always changing, and everything it does, it contains nothing but a potential for more change. Whereas when it's dead, all that potential seems to disappear. Of course, in the broad scheme of things, it doesn't disappear, because dead things become part of the environment, they decay, and you know, you can take the simple example of Saugus Iron Works. I always like to use that, where the citizens of the Massachusetts Bay Colony built the biggest integrated iron foundry and manufacturing capability in the world in the late 17th century in Saugus, Massachusetts. And they made this iron and the tools they made out of the iron by using a form of iron called bog iron, which was the basically decayed or dead fossilized bodies of bacteria which lived in the swamps of Massachusetts that metabolized iron, and then they would fall to the bottom of these bogs and clump together, so that life gave them the iron. They would use the shells of oysters and clams for the calcium to bind with the impurities and to get the pure iron. They'd make the tools, which became the basis for the economic progress in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which allowed for the flowering of the ideas that became the basis for the American Revolution. So they're right there, a simple example of the interaction of life, non-life, and cognition, which not just changed the physical state of the world, but changed the social organization of man. So I don't know if LaRouche looked at that particular thing, although he did spend his young life for part of the time in Massachusetts and was quite familiar with the culture of the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
No, he talked about the Saugus Iron Works too.
Yeah, I know. I learned about it from Graham Lowry, who was a real genius, and I had the fortune of going for a tour of Saugus with Graham. But that's just a simple example of something which exhibits a completely opposite process of the second law of thermodynamics. It's always increasing its potential for change, because not only did they increase the potential to change the economic life of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they created the cognitive potential to create a unique form of social organization that today we call the American Republic. And that also changed the potential, both physical and cognitively, for all mankind. So that creates a ever increasing capability of change. So this requires, first of all, it requires developing the kind of scientific thinking that rejects Cartesianism, rejects the idea that the mathematical laws of physics can account for life and cognition, because it cannot. And in fact, even Leibniz showed that these kinds of mechanistic concepts can't even account for mechanical systems. Leibniz developed, for example, the famous idea of what today people call potential energy, which he called vis viva, which is not a mechanical force or a mechanical property, and that even the behavior of mechanical bodies cannot be explained without what he called metaphysical principles. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want, but so you have to reject this Cartesianism, but yet most people today, first of all, most scientists today accept this idea of this mechanical idea, to the point where if you put forward anything opposite to that, you get roundly attacked, as LaRouche was. You're anti-scientific and so forth. But you also cannot make any scientific discoveries. And any scientific discoveries that are made in the name, which often happens, people will make a scientific discovery by rejecting this mechanistic view of science, use it through their creativity. But then in order to get it published in a scientific journal, or presented in an academic environment, they have to write it in a form which destroys any creative ideas which went in. People have to hide their creativity. Now, and even the great scientist Max Planck, who did a huge amount of work on thermodynamics, spent a lot of time digging into the assumptions behind this idea of thermodynamics. And he showed in a very rigorous way that the whole thing, all these conclusions about entropy and about thermodynamics, are all a result of one simple assumption, that the universe that activity in the universe is based on the interaction of random individual particles. And if you accept that from that follows the necessity for thinking that the universe, or the behavior of the universe, is the things we see around us that are structure, that are order, that are progressive, is the result of random interactions and subject only to the laws of probability. In the paper that we talked about last week, that LaRouche wrote in the 1980s on artificial intelligence, LaRouche made the comparison that this kind of thinking is the same as secular humanism. It's a belief that there is no purpose to the universe. It's an atheistic belief that there's, as opposed to the idea that the universe is at its core not a collection of random particles, but actually all physical activity in the universe is the result of an underlying creative process. That the universe has an irreversible tendency to create new forms of organization, new structures, each of which creates higher forms of organization. If you say that in science today, they call you a nut. But the truth of the matter is that's the only thing that explains anything that's going on. And what's surprising and also encouraging is that there's a growing small but rigorous group of young scientists who, for various reasons, are steering themselves along this path. And I think that also gives us a lot of hope. I think it's consistent with the awakening of the population that we see away from being subjected to these forms of artificial intelligence and behavioral control to one in which they seek to respect and encourage the creative powers. We have a lot of work to do on that, especially because of popular culture. But since it's Beethoven's birthday, I think is worth reflecting on the role of great art in reversing that tendency.
You wanted to carry further into thermodynamics and economics? It's
okay, well,
coming close to the end.
Yeah, well, you see this also in economics. The way LaRouche said, if you look at the economy from a thermodynamic standpoint, you can see that the economy, mankind has to produce both the means of physical production. He called this capital, constant capital, and then the means of maintaining the human population, which he called variable capital. And but that also the activity, the economic behavior of mankind produces also a surplus, that is a physical output that is above and beyond what it consumes in the production of that physical output. And if you put this in thermodynamic terms, it can be stated this way, that the energy of the system increases because your population increases, but at the same time, the surplus increases at a greater rate. And the question is, where does that come from? Now, Tony, maybe if you can put up that chart.
Yes, I will.
It's sort of a heuristic chart which illustrates this thermodynamic principle, which LaRouche used, I think, in the 1990s. But I've always found it quite well. I don't know how easily you can see this on
Looks good to me, but
but I'll just read it through. He calls this the machine tool principle. So in the higher level, the first level, the input of your economy, you can think about this as it is a machine, a chart of activity of how an economy develops. So your input here is current levels of development of individual creative reason. So note that LaRouche starts with an immaterial substance, not raw materials, not factories, not machines, so forth, with ideas. Okay, that increase in the levels of development of individual creative reason, which is a potential. It's the development of creative reason, but it hasn't created anything. That power leads to the discoveries of valid scientific principles. That leads to discoveries of valid new hypotheses. Okay, how do these principles express themselves? How do they work? And then you get two things from that. One is classical humanist education, which is new ideas about man and man's relationship to man. You see that since it's Beethoven's birthday, the idea of what the mind is capable of generating has completely changed by Beethoven's compositions, musical compositions, which down to this day is still teaching us a power of mind that is extraordinary. And then the other side is a physical operation, which is machine tool designs. This you could think all the way back to, for example, the development of the heat-powered machine, which replaced muscle and animal power.
So we went from, just to reiterate we went from discoveries of valid new hypotheses on the one side here, classical humanist education, on the other side, from the same process, even though differently expressed, discoveries of valid new hypotheses leading to machine tool designs.
Yeah, parenthetically, you could use the example of the Brunelleschi dome to express this, because Brunelleschi came up with the design to produce a dome across the cathedral in Florence. It was the largest dome ever built. And he, as part of the Renaissance thinkers, wanted to make it beautiful from both the outside and the inside to express the creative powers of the mind, the power of the human mind. So to actually implement this, he had to design a whole new science of structural engineering, because there was no way to build something this big with the traditional methods of scaffolding and so forth. So without having to go through all the details, he did. And he had to invent new machines. He had to invent new designs. And just as importantly, he had to educate and organize the workmen who were going to be implementing these things, to not just understand how to operate these designs, but how to believe in them, have enough confidence in the principles they were based on, that they would literally risk their lives on the basis of Brunelleschi's design. So that's another example of an actual economic development. Then you see, of course, the two next steps are coherent with what I just said: the development of the labor force and new and improved product designs. And then from that, you get infrastructure designs, productive processes, increasing capital intensity, increasing power intensity. And those are the, once this kind of knowledge gets into the population, you get the development of all these new possibilities, which then have applications which cannot even be conceived of. I mean, for example, when the laser was first invented in the Bell Labs in the 1950s, nobody had any idea really what its application would be. It was a design based on all these things that we've talked about, and yet look at the applications of lasers in the modern economy, in the wide manifestation of lasers. That's just one example. Okay, then you have that leads to labor force and machine tool designs are combined, and then you get productive processes, development, increased productivity, because you increase the power of every individual worker in and over nature, so productivity dramatically increases. And then you get an increase in potential relative population density as a result. Now, the increase of potential relative population density, I know we've talked about it before, but this was central to LaRouche's ideas. What you're talking about there is, population density. Take the concept backwards. Start with population density, which is how many people can live on a given area of land. And of course, in a hunter-gathering society, that's very small. But as you develop things like agriculture and water management and manufacturing and so forth, the population density increases. But there's another element of this, which is that the population density in different parts of the earth is relative to the physical conditions. For example, the population density in the areas of desert areas is different than in rainforest areas or in savannas and grass areas and so forth. There's many characteristics here. So it's relative to and that changes with technology. As we develop water systems and so forth, we can green deserts. So the population density, the relative population density of a desert area dramatically increases with technology. And so what's important is not just the relative population density, but the potential relative population density. What kind of improvements through this machine tool process can actually increase the relative population density of the area. So that's the parameter that indicates an anti-entropic process, a process that's actually going to higher states of organization and existence rather than towards equilibrium. But that's not the end of the productive process. The end of the productive process is higher levels of development of individual creative reason. So you go back to the beginning, which is you start with current levels of development of creative reason. That's the input into economic process. And the output is higher levels of development of individual creative reason. Now, I'm sure you cannot tell me a single economist, policymaker, academic, or anybody who can tell you that this is what the economy is about. Is anybody talking about economic policy from the standpoint of transforming current levels of development of individual creative reason to higher levels of development of individual creative reason? And this really is the key to what's going to determine the future of mankind. The ability to understand and make these concepts that LaRouche developed, starting with his 1948 fight with Wiener and Shannon, the generally understood and accepted basic principles of economics. You have to subsume all other policy questions to this process. And if we can learn this ourselves and understand this ourselves, there's a great future for mankind.
Terrific. Thank you so much.